If you've spent any time on YouTube over the past several months, you've probably run into some version of this video already. Grok AI translated ancient Sumerian tablets. The truth about human races shocked researchers. Scientists used Grok AI to translate Sumerian tablets. What it revealed about humanity is terrifying. They ran ancient Sumerian tablets through Grok AI. What it found shocked biblical scholars. Dozens of these videos, across dozens of channels, all published within weeks of each other, all promising the same basic premise. An AI chatbot fed the oldest writing on Earth into its system and uncovered something about human origins that professional archaeologists and Assyriologists had somehow missed for 150 years of scholarship. Here's the actual story, and it's a genuinely fascinating one, just not for the reason the thumbnails want you to believe. Sumerian and Akkadian tablets really do contain a description of how humans were created, and it really is a striking, unsettling piece of ancient literature. Real scholars have known about it, studied it, and published detailed translations of it since the 19th century. Grok didn't discover it. Grok, when asked, mostly just repeated it back, sometimes accurately, sometimes blended with over a century of pseudo-archaeological speculation that's been circulating in books and online content for decades. Stick around, because separating what's genuinely in the ancient texts from what got bolted on afterward is where the story actually gets interesting. Let's start with what's real, because the actual Mesopotamian mythology here doesn't need any exaggeration to be worth talking about. Two of the most important surviving pieces of Mesopotamian literature, the Atrahasis epic, composed in Old Babylonian, roughly around the 18th century BCE, and the later Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, both describe the origin of human beings in strikingly similar terms. In the Atrahasis account, the senior gods had grown weary of performing hard physical labor themselves, digging canals, maintaining irrigation systems, and eventually rebelled against that burden. To resolve the crisis, the god Enki proposed a solution: create a new class of being to take over the labor. A god named Wi-Ila, or Geshtu-e in some versions, was slaughtered, and his flesh and blood were mixed with clay by the mother goddess to form the first humans, whose entire purpose, as the text states plainly, was to work in place of the gods. The later Enuma Elish tells a related but distinct version of essentially the same idea, with the god Marduk creating humanity from the blood of the defeated rebel god Kingu, mixed with clay. Again, specifically, so that the gods could be relieved of labor. That's real. It's genuinely striking, thematically rich material. Humans created not out of love, but out of divine convenience, from a mixture of clay and the blood of an executed deity, to function as a workforce. It's the kind of detail that absolutely deserves a video built around it. But it isn't a secret, and it isn't something that required an AI chatbot to surface. These texts have been known, translated, and taught in university Assyriology and ancient Near Eastern studies programs for well over a century. Since cuneiform script was first deciphered in the mid-1800s by scholars, including Henry Rawlinson and George Smith, and steadily refined by generations of specialists since. Reliable, carefully annotated English translations of both the Atrahasis epic and the Enuma Elish are easily accessible in academic publications by scholars like Stephanie Daly and Benjamin Foster, whose work forms the actual scholarly foundation for anyone seriously studying these texts. It's worth sitting with just how much specialized labor sits behind those translations, because it puts the AI decoded this framing in real perspective. The Atrahasis tablets themselves survive across multiple fragmentary copies, recovered from different archaeological sites and different time periods, none of them fully intact on their own. Reconstructing a coherent translation meant cross-referencing overlapping fragments recovered decades apart, filling gaps using parallel phrasing found in other Akkadian religious texts, and resolving genuine scholarly disagreements about specific sign readings, the kind of painstaking, cross-checked philological work that takes years, not seconds. George Smith's original 19th century decipherment work on related Mesopotamian flood narratives famously caused a sensation in its own era, and it was the product of years spent painstakingly matching cuneiform signs to their Akkadian phonetic values, working directly from the physical tablets housed in the British Museum. That's the actual origin story of how humanity first learned what these tablets said. It has nothing to do with a chatbot prompt typed in 2026. So if the material is genuinely old and genuinely well documented, what's actually happening when someone asks Grok to decode it? This is the part worth understanding carefully because it explains why this specific topic became such fertile ground for viral misrepresentation. Cuneiform, the wedge-shaped writing system used across Sumerian, Akkadian, and several other ancient Mesopotamian languages, is not something you can hand to a general-purpose chatbot the way you'd paste in a paragraph of French for translation. Reading it properly requires years of specialized training in paleography, the study of ancient writing forms, because individual signs can carry multiple possible readings depending on context, period, and dialect. It requires working from photographs, drawings, or direct examination of the physical clay tablets themselves, many of which are damaged, broken, or only partially preserved, requiring scholarly judgment to reconstruct missing sections based on parallel texts and established grammatical patterns. And it requires deep familiarity with an established body of academic lexica and sign lists that took generations of specialists to compile and refine. A large language model like Grok does not have direct access to unpublished tablets sitting in museum storage, and it cannot independently examine a physical clay artifact. What it can do is draw on whatever text about Sumerian and Akkadian mythology already exists in its training data or turns up in a web search, which includes, alongside legitimate academic translations, an enormous volume of decades-old pseudo-archaeological material that has never been accepted by mainstream scholarship, but that circulates online with exactly the same confident, authoritative tone as the real academic sources. When a chatbot is asked to decode or reveal something from these tablets, it's not performing original paleographic work. It's synthesizing a response from whatever mixture of accurate and inaccurate material about this topic happens to be most heavily represented in the data it's drawing from. And on this particular subject, that mixture skews unusually far toward speculation. And that speculation has a specific name and a specific origin, because almost all of the shocking framing attached to these videos traces back to one source, Zechariah Sitchin. Sitchin, a writer with no formal academic training in Assyriology, Sumerology, or ancient Near Eastern languages, published a book in 1976 called The 12th Planet, proposing that the Anunnaki, a real term from actual Sumerian and Akkadian mythology, referring to a category of divine beings or gods in the Mesopotamian pantheon, were literal extraterrestrial visitors from an undiscovered planet he called Nibiru, who genetically engineered early humans as a slave labor force to mine gold. This theory has been extensively and repeatedly rejected by professional Assyriologists and Sumerologists who have identified specific, well-documented mistranslations underlying nearly every major claim in Sitchin's work, including his core interpretation of the term Anunnaki itself, which in the actual texts simply denotes divine or supernatural beings within Mesopotamian religious cosmology, not aliens from a specific undiscovered planet. No credible astronomical evidence supports the existence of the planet Sitchin called Nibiru, and no peer-reviewed Assyriological scholarship treats his translations as methodologically sound. Despite that, his work has had an enormously long afterlife in popular alternative history media, precisely because it offers a dramatic, ready-made explanation that layers cleanly on top of real ancient texts that already describe humans being created by gods for a specific purpose. Sitchin didn't need to invent the underlying mythology. He just needed to reinterpret it. And nearly 50 years later, that same reinterpretation is exactly what keeps resurfacing whenever someone asks a chatbot a leading question about what Sumerian tablets really say about human origins. This is where the AI hallucination problem compounds an already existing misinformation problem, rather than creating a new one from scratch. As covered in similar viral AI archaeology claims, large language models are well documented to occasionally generate confident, fluent, specific-sounding responses that are factually incorrect, a phenomenon researchers call hallucination, arising from how these systems predict plausible text rather than verify claims against ground truth. On a topic like Sumerian mythology, where genuine academic translations already coexist online with roughly 50 years of confidently written, Sitchin-derived content, a chatbot has a much harder task distinguishing which framing to reproduce than it would on a topic with a cleaner, less contested body of source material. Ask a leading question. Something like, what do Sumerian tablets reveal about human origins that mainstream science hasn't told us? And you're not just risking a hallucinated answer. You're actively steering the model toward the exact corner of its training data most heavily populated by decades of pseudo-archaeological reinterpretation, dressed up in language that already sounds like a suppressed revelation waiting to be uncovered. And then there's the sheer volume of nearly identical videos built around this exact premise, which is itself worth noticing as a pattern. Within a fairly tight window, a cluster of videos appeared using nearly interchangeable framing. Grok decoding tablets about human races, about a mysterious frequency, about what happens to the soul after death, about creation myths reframed as manufactured labor. Different channels, different specific angles, but the same underlying structure repeated over and over. Take a real, genuinely interesting piece of ancient mythology, run it through a chatbot, with a leading prompt, and present whatever comes back as a fresh, AI-verified revelation rather than what it actually is. A chatbot restating decades-old material, sometimes accurately and sometimes not. without doing any of the specialized philological work that word decoded implies. That's not evidence of a genuine breakthrough happening simultaneously across dozens of independent research teams. It's evidence of a content format that reliably generates clicks, being reproduced by multiple creators once its effectiveness became obvious. It's worth naming the underlying incentive plainly, because it explains why this specific format keeps reproducing itself. A video framed around a chatbot uncovering forbidden or hidden knowledge borrows credibility from two directions at once: genuine, long-standing public fascination with ancient civilizations and the origins of humanity, and a newer, still-forming public trust in AI systems as somehow more objective or more capable than an ordinary source. Neither of those two ingredients requires the underlying claim to actually be true in order to generate views, which is exactly why the same structure keeps getting reused with a new ancient civilization, a new artifact, or a new chatbot swapped in each time. It's worth pausing on a few of those specific video variants because they reveal how far this pattern can drift from anything resembling the actual ancient source material. Some of the videos in this cluster go considerably further than reinterpreting real mythology. Titles promising a Sumerian tablet describing a frequency humans were never meant to hear, or detailed accounts of what happens to the soul immediately after death, framed as newly AI-verified revelations. It's worth being direct about these specific claims. No established, peer-reviewed translation of any known Sumerian or Akkadian tablet describes anything resembling a dangerous or forbidden acoustic frequency. That concept doesn't appear anywhere in the corpus of texts recovered from Mesopotamian archaeological sites, cross-referenced against the sign lists and lexica built up over a century and a half of Assyriological scholarship. When a chatbot produces a specific, detailed claim like that in response to a leading prompt, it's very likely generating exactly the kind of fabricated, confident-sounding detail covered earlier. Hallucinated content that has no basis in any actual ancient text, dressed up with a real ancient-sounding label attached to make it feel grounded. Mesopotamian religion did have detailed, genuinely documented beliefs about the afterlife. The underworld realm known as Kur or Irkalla, described in real translated texts, like the myth of Inanna's descent, is a legitimate and fascinating subject on its own. But the specific framing found in these particular viral videos routinely goes well beyond what any actual translated tablet says, and that gap between the real underworld mythology and the AI-generated elaboration on top of it is exactly the kind of thing worth checking before taking a video's claims at face value. So what's the actual, honest version of this story? The one that doesn't need an AI hallucination to be worth 15 minutes of your attention. Ancient Mesopotamian texts really do describe humanity's creation in genuinely dark, memorable terms, shaped from clay mixed with the blood of a slain god, purpose-built to relieve the gods of physical labor, not born out of affection, but manufactured out of necessity. That's a real, well-documented piece of one of the oldest literary traditions on Earth, and it says something genuinely striking about how the people of ancient Mesopotamia understood their own place in the cosmos as a workforce created to serve a divine bureaucracy, rather than as beings specially loved into existence. Real Assyriologists have been translating, cross-referencing, and publishing detailed academic analysis of exactly this material for over 100 years, using methods far more rigorous than typing a leading question into a chatbot. None of that required Grok or any AI system to reveal it. It was never hidden. It's been sitting in published academic translations, openly available in any university library the entire time. What Grok or any large language model actually adds to that picture, when it adds anything at all, is a synthesis of what's already out there, filtered through no independent expertise, no direct access to the physical tablets, and no ability to distinguish reliably between a century of careful academic scholarship and 50 years of ungrounded pseudo-archaeological reinterpretation layered on top of it. Sometimes that synthesis lines up with the real scholarship. Sometimes, especially when the question is phrased to invite a dramatic answer, it doesn't. Either way, AI decoded ancient tablets is the wrong description for what's actually happening. A more accurate one would be, someone asked a chatbot a leading question about a genuinely fascinating slice of real ancient mythology and got back a fluent, confident-sounding response that may or may not reflect what trained specialists, working directly from the actual clay, have spent a century and a half carefully establishing. If pulling apart claims like this, finding the real, genuinely fascinating history buried underneath the viral framing, is what you come here for, subscribe, because there's always another one of these making the rounds, and the real story underneath is almost always stranger and better documented than the AI headline gives it credit for.